Hello everyone, it is Tuesday, I am Tuesday, and today we're going to be talking about The Neverending Story by Michael Ende, and its accompanying movie. One of its accompanying movies, that is. The book was split into two separate films made 7 years apart and 20 years before Twilight claimed to have invented the concept. For that reason, I'm only going to be covering the first half of the book in this review, though I do plan to cover the second half of the book eventually. In the meantime, feel free to subscribe so you're able to catch the sequel, or leave a comment calling me a nerd. I read all of them and respond to most, so let's strike up a conversation. Anyway, what was I talking about again? Twilight. When being adapted to film, the final book in Stephenie Meyer's supernatural romance series was split in two, with each movie being filmed at once and then being released during consecutive years. However, much like me splitting this up into two separate reviews, this was mainly done in the interest of profit, with studio executives attempting to squeeze as much capital from the populace as humanly possible by riding the hype train up Fat Stacks Mountain. In reality, there was no reason to bifurcate the story. The novel runs pretty smoothly from one plot point to another without any major time skips or tonal changes. Sure, more of the details from Breaking Dawn got to be adapted, but as far as I can tell, that had never been a concern for movie producers when adapting a narrative work in the past. Plenty of story beats have been left on the cutting room floor in order to condense even monstrous tales into a neat 2.5-hour package. The motivation for chopping up a story like this within the past 20 years is, and always has been, about profit over narrative sensibility. The Neverending Story is a little different. Ende's book can be evenly split into two separate stories, existing both as a breakout hit and lackluster sequel within the span of about 400 pages. The first half follows Atreyu during the final days of Fantastica as it succumbs to the encroaches of the all-consuming nothing, while the second half is a story about a 12-year-old who learns the dangers of playing God. Even though the movement from one tale to another makes sense within the confines of the story, the narrative shift felt quite jarring when I was reading it. Chapter 13 feels very decisively like the ending to a book while introducing the given circumstances required to set up a sequel. This shift is mostly marked by the removal of the meta-narrative, outside of the all-encompassing voice of the narrator, as it is foregone in order to follow a relatively simple, if meandering, tale about the representative of the childlike empress and his divine abilities. For this reason, anyone trying to adapt the Neverending Story to the big screen has a clear non-monetary incentive to split the story in two, as doing so makes sense on both a narrative and accessibility level. By limiting the scope of the movie to just the Atreyu stuff, the amount of narrative confusion felt by the target audience is kept to a minimum. You see, both the book and the movies are intended for children, and their contents are reflective of that fact. Despite containing some violent imagery and giving lip service to some darker existential themes, neither version of this story goes harder than an old-school Disney-fied fairy tale. Each chapter exists as its own self-contained story, a la The Hobbit, as if it were intended to be read bit by bit before bed every night. On top of this, light-hearted family movies of this era tended to top out around 90 minutes, as it was assumed this was the longest a story could hold a younger audience's interest. In light of all of this, the move to axe the second half of the novel seems reasonable, and that's before we get to any of the economic incentives. We'll get into that in a minute, though. First, we need to talk about the basis for this 1984 classic, the whole cloth that was left over after sawing off half of the sewing table. In other words, what the fuck is this book about anyway? Story. Bastian Balthazar Bucks, in the words of the author, is a pudgy, bow-legged boy of about 11 or 12 years of age who is constantly picked on by his peers for being weak and his teachers for being distracted. His father loves him, but hardly acknowledges him. His only friend moved away to boarding school, and his mother is dead. In Bastian's mind, he's a loser, and the rest of the world tends to agree with him. Heck, even the wizened old man who sends Bastian forth on his journey can't stand to be near him. Carl Conrad Coriander hates children and does everything in his power to make Bastian piss off. For the adventure to even get started, Bastian must commit a robbery, stealing the ancient and mystical-looking tome titled only as The Neverending Story. Oh, did I forget to mention? The Neverending Story, the book, is a book which canonically exists within the book The Neverending Story. Confused? Don't worry about it. You get used to it pretty quickly. The whole first half of the novel is a pensive metatextual tale, whose main villain is the physical embodiment of growing into an adult and forgetting the dreams you had when you were a child. Did I also forget to mention that this book was originally written in German? Whatever. Bastian takes the book to the attic of his school as he has decided to hide where no one would search for him, considering he's now a wanted criminal. It is here that we are introduced to the story within the story, the real story, if you may, that which was promised on the book's back cover. The realm of Fantastica has been struck with an unexplainable calamity. Pockets of nothing have appeared and begun consuming the world. The nothing is indescribable, as trying to do so would be something, and thus not representative of what the nothing actually is. The spread of this absence is inextricably linked to the ruler of Fantastica, the childlike Empress, and a strange, incurable illness which has fallen over her. For you see, the Empress needs a new name, one which can only be given to her by a human from the normal human world. In order to find this human, the boy Atreus, similar in age to Bastian, is tasked with scouring the land in search of a hero. This does not go well. To kick things off, Atreus' horse dies in the swamps of sadness. Then he gets poisoned by a swarm of magical killer insects. Then he forgets who he is, and gets kicked around by cloud giants, and nearly drowns, and loses the MacGuffin protecting him from overt danger, and gets mauled by an interdimensional werewolf. All of this to fail in his quest of bringing a human who can actually save the childlike Empress. But hey, at least he gets to fly around on a luck dragon, so that's cool. Atreus' story is fascinating to me because, despite every chapter moving him closer to success, the entirety of his journey is glazed over with this inextricable sense of loss. The world he lives in is dying, and this is reflected in pretty much every interaction he has. Eldritch, godlike deities bemoan their impending demise. Horrific specters and terrors of the night dance gleefully before throwing themselves into oblivion. Entire continents are wiped from the memory of existence. The longer Atreyu travels, the worse everything gets, just for him to return to the childlike Empress believing himself to be a failure. I would argue that this is kind of the point, though. The childlike Empress herself says that Atreyu has to suffer in order to catch the attention of a human and hold their interest. It is certainly what kept Bastian reading through all the trials and tribulations, and it's probably what kept you and I reading as well. I'll go into this more whenever I talk about the second half of the book, but this is essentially a meta-commentary on the audience's need for narrative tension. If Enda hadn't made the stakes so high, if the struggles hadn't been so intimately felt, then nobody would have read far enough to be able to save Fantastica. We would have put the book down, forgotten about it, and allowed the nothing to continue consuming our dreams. Fantastica would die, and we would all grow up to be boring husks, not dissimilar to Bastian's father. Instead, the story is structured in a way that makes us want to keep reading. In other words, is well written, with the novel as a whole and a couple of characters being aware of that fact. By the time the childlike Empress decides to loop the story and force Bastian's hand, she is well aware that we're hooked. The intrigue of Atreyu's failings, wonder of Fantastica's landscapes, and the self-aware connections of the meta-narrative have all been effective ploys to keep us invested, and thus save her own life and world. I cannot stress enough how much the first half of this book is unlike anything I've ever read before, to the point where I'm pretty sure it's one of the earliest examples of meta-commentary being used to this extent in popular media. Correct me down below if I'm wrong, but the mass adoption of postmodern self-referentialism is a product of the 90s onward. While The Neverending Story doesn't reach the same level of this that modern media does, it's still interesting to see those types of stories take shape. For that alone, I would give the first half of this novel a 6 out of 10, but the charm of everything that surrounds the meta-commentary really helps bring that score home. It's really no surprise that this got adapted into a major motion picture. I guess the real question is, should it have? It's the 80s, baby! Welcome to the world of cocaine-fueled synth-pop and scanline fascism. Coming off of The Dark Crystal's mixed success at the box office, studio executives like me are attempting to take what was unique from that film, the dark setting and puppets and whatnot, and market it to a wider audience in a more commercially viable manner. Thankfully for us, some German dude in 1979 wrote that book that took the world by storm, but this time in a good way. Unlike The Dark Crystal, this story comes preset with millions of fans the world over and would require less coercion via marketing to get butts in seats at the theater. If we give it the old razzle-dazzle, throw in some comic relief and a healthy dose of practical puppetry, we should be sitting on a box office hit that'll skyrocket our bank accounts higher than the escorts we call to our Beverly Hills mansions. God damn it, it's a surefire hit! One of the biggest problems with in-depth fantasy adaptations in the 1980s was budget. Hey, I told you we'd get back to that. The entry cost necessary to create a marketable film that doesn't look like garbage in this era were immense, especially when considering the whimsical nature of Fantastica. Everything needs to feel lived in, tangible, alive in a way that anyone could interact with. To this end, characters of vastly different size and body plan have to be able to interact with each other in a semi-seamless manner in order to suspend the audience's disbelief. Because with a story and premise as weird as Fantastica's, anything that looks out of place will cause the suspension to crumble. As a result, filmmakers are almost bottlenecked into Lord of the Rings trilogy levels of pre- and post-production in order to make the movie look right, i.e., believable to the average moviegoer. To expound on this point, I would be willing to guess that over 90% of the shots in this film were composed using some sort of practical effect, forced perspective, or editing technique, oftentimes all at once. We've got matte paintings, animatronic puppets, scaled miniatures, massive sets built on sound stages, rotoscoping. Sometimes actors just perform their scenes in front of projections of their counterparts. Other times the camera pretends like two people are in the same room handing things off to each other when any thought into the matter would show that they aren't. The filmmakers working on this pulled out every trick in the book to make Fantastica come to life. They did everything right. The only problem is that they didn't do any of it very well, and the studio-mandated comedy added to this film did not do much to help with this fact. With a budget of around 27 million Orwell bucks, certain script concessions had to be made in an attempt to appeal to wider audiences, much to the apparent chagrin of the author. I don't know if this was a studio mandate or an executive decision on the part of the screenwriter/director, but the result has disastrous effects for the feel of the movie's world. My major issue comes from the seemingly unnecessary amount of camp thrown into the script, as it helps to highlight the shoddy effects work as opposed to glossing it over. The first 15 minutes of this film hold a dissonant mix of the serious and the absurd. We start with a woobly opening credits scene, overdubbed with some mid-tier English synth pop. This feeds directly into Bastian's dad telling him he needs to stop thinking about his dead mother. Then, Bastian gets thrown in a dumpster by bullies before hiding in Coriander's bookshop, which gets us to where the book actually starts. Once inside, the kid playing Bastian just screams his lines at the guy playing Coriander, who's doing his absolute best to sound mysterious and foreboding, despite having an objectively dogshit scene partner. Even once we get to Fantastica, the first few minutes experiencing the realm are full of slapstick and sight gags. All of this helps to plant the idea that we shouldn't take the world seriously, that we should look to laugh rather than look to understand, and that mindset starts to fire death blows at the rest of the production. Once we as an audience have adopted the belief that we shouldn't take the story seriously, what may have been minor effects or editing grievances begin to stick out like a sore thumb. Like, look at this kid in the background right here, or the scene where Artax dies. Or the first Falcor flight scene. The longer you watch, the more these problems start to arise. The film looks cheap. The editing feels rushed. There are holes in the narrative which simply do not exist in the book. On top of that, the more we laugh at shoddy production quality, the more likely we are to laugh at shoddy production quality. So when, for some reason, Bastian is able to take Falcor into the real world and chase his bullies at the end of the movie, we are physically incapable of taking the movie seriously anymore and chalk it up to a cheap, campy slog that really doesn't deserve more consideration. Which is a shame, because I can definitely envision a world where this adaptation would have shown. Imagine for a moment if this had been animated. Suddenly, all of the constraints of puppets and sets are gone. The whimsical vision of Fantastica could have been fully realized while adding a sharp contrast between Bastion's world and that of the Neverending Story, through how realistic the art style is. Additionally, this book is highly serialized, so it would make more sense to split it up into a miniseries, which would allow both for more of the novel to be adapted and better pacing overall. Even the addition of comedy would work better in this medium. It's the animated land of dreams, for goodness sake. You're telling me you can't add in sight gags? If the f***ing Berserk manga can throw comedy into the mix, then guess what, bub? You can too. Unfortunately, back here in reality, the actually produced movie suffers from a litany of production problems which compound upon themselves until they just become the movie. It's pumped full of goofy edits and synth tracks and forces audiences to laugh at rather than with it. That's about it though. I don't think I have any other oh god, the acting. In the book, Atreyu is a pensive, clever boy who attempts to think through solutions when faced with overwhelming odds. He is brave, more than willing to battle his enemies, but his physical prowess is reduced as a result of his diminutive stature, forcing him to try and outthink his enemies as opposed to battling them outright. When it really comes down to it, Atreyu's mind is what brings him closer to the completion of his quest, more than any other heroic factor. In the movie, he just screams.
You'll die too!
The kid who plays Bastion is the exact same way. In the book, Bastion is a weak-willed, unsure child who fundamentally fears being able to succeed in living his wildest dreams. In the movie, though, every single one of his lines is either a whisper or a screech, with no intermediary. By the time the third half of the movie kicked off, I had grown so irritated with their whinging that I found myself audibly saying, "Just shut up, man." I think the root of this problem lies in the radioactive sludge that arises when we combine bad actors with bad direction. You see, bad actors can be passable, or even do really well, when paired with a good director who has a clear vision for the character and story. At the same time, bad or middling directors can seem like pure geniuses when paired with actors who know what they're doing. However, when you pair a bad actor with bad direction, you might get hit with some of the most delicious dumpster fire garbage ever imaginable. Truly. A real stinker for the ages. This is the realm of acting that the Neverending Story, the movie, tends to inhabit. Child actors tend to be god-awful in general, but the ones in this movie seem especially bad, and I think that has to do in large part with the direction. Let's just say there's a reason why neither of these kids really did anything beyond this movie, besides Troll. Does anybody remember that movie? Isn't the main character named Harry Potter Jr.? Hang on. Okay, guys, I fucked up here. Twilight wasn't actually the first one to split the final adaptation of its book into two movies. Deathly Hallows Part 1 started the trend just 1 year earlier, which means that it was actually the Harry Potter franchise that claimed to have invented splitting the book into two parts, stealing the idea from a dark fantasy film in the 1980s. Troll, released in 1986, is a story about a boy named Harry Potter who discovers a magical otherworld and is hunted by the evil leader of a magical extremist movement who believes himself to be better than the non-magical humans he shares the world with, which means that Harry Potter, the series, first released in 1997, stole its idea from a dark fantasy film from the 1980s, yet Joanne likes to pretend that she's so special and creative. Oh, look at me, I'm the only one who can come up with magical otherworlds and boys named Harry Potter. It all just came to me while I was unemployed, riding around on the tube. Shut up. Shut up. You're not special, you trans-hating, genocidal, fascist piece of As a whole, while I wouldn't say this movie is particularly good, I definitely think it is worth your time to watch, especially with friends. As I've said in the past, my rating system doesn't have to do with quality, but rather how much it is worth your time to interact with. It's rated on a bell curve, with anything over 3, i.e. 4 or more, being worth the time invested to engage with it. That being said, if you watch this on your own, I'd put it at around a 5, just because of how goofy it is. But it could definitely go up to a 6 or even a 7, depending on who you watch it with and what y'all are doing while you watch it. Anyway, for those of you who stuck around, I appreciate it. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. Did you watch this movie as a kid? If so, are you afraid to go back to it now that you're an adult? Did any of you by chance read the book? Is this the first time you've ever heard of this franchise? Please, let me know and we can start up a conversation. If you like what I do, but don't want to subscribe yet, I've got more of it here to try to sway your opinion. As always, it is Tuesday, I am Tuesday, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!